Hello there and welcome to the show. This is the last episode of 2020 and what I'm doing is a first in that it's the first time I'm playing a rerun of an episode. There were certain signs actually telling me to rerun this one. Why this episode? Well, it's episode 8. So first of all, this episode was released on the 2nd of April 2018, but don't let that worry you. It still has absolute relevance today. I was thinking as a podcast listener, when I find a great show, how far back in the back catalogue do I really go? I've been listening to Tim Ferriss, his podcast, all week, but I've never really listened to the first 100 episodes. So always like the last 100. So I thought episode 8. I mean, how many of you have listened to that? If you have, wow, thank you so much. If you haven't, I'm doing you a favor today by bringing this one back from the vault. Now, the reason I chose this episode is also because of a cool story of what happened after the podcast. So today's episode 8, was with Matthew Dix. He's the author of the book Storyworthy, which I've gifted to a lot of people that want to get better at storytelling. This is the book that I recommend. You'll hear more of his intro and what he does in the original recording, which is coming up shortly. What I really found helpful about his book is how practical it is and the concept, which is called homework for life, which is at the end of every day, just take a note of something that happened that day, which you may have found a lesson in. His approach to storytelling makes it very real. And I guess a question I often found was when I was running a workshop was how do I remember stories to share in the moment? And you can't, right? You've got to document them every day using this tool called Homework for Life. Now, what else happened is this podcast, episode 8, right? Not many listeners. I was just finding my feet. But what it did was introduce me to 2 people in Brisbane that were listening in, Kate Norris and Thomas Krafft from Presentation Boss. They've both been guests on the show, but we never would have met without the podcast. When we did meet, all we could talk about was how great Matthew Dix was, how great he was as a guest and his whole approach on storytelling. They love him too. They started their own podcast because of the impact that First Time Facilitator had. I sort of shared all the cool stuff that happened as a result of having a podcast. They got Matthew on their show. Then they started running Life Out Loud storytelling events in Brisbane, which are based off Matthew's storytelling event called Speak Up Storytelling over in the US. So as a result of just a conversation I had with Matthew one morning, this whole event happened. Kate and Thomas invited me to share a story at one of their live events where I told a story about career lessons I picked up from one of my chickens. Then COVID hit this year and they ended up moving their Life Out Loud storytelling to virtual. And guess who was on the speaking bill? So Thomas, Kate, Matthew Dix was on there and myself. It's a whole full circle moment. I remember feeling a little bit nervous when you're telling a story in front of the story master, but he was just lovely. And of course, his story right at the end was just amazing. Now, another sign to replay this episode is that Matthew is releasing his 6th novel called The Other Mother in January. He's actually doing a Zoom book launch. I've signed up for that. It's a free book launch via Zoom. And to celebrate the fact that he's doing this, it's on the 16th of January. I'll put the details in the show notes. Now, what I love most about Matthew's approach is what he shared in his latest newsletter about stories. I'll read it to you. Small stories, friends. The best stories are so often the small ones, the ones that our audience understand well, connect to, relate to. You need not have a glorious or suspenseful or terrifying adventure to tell a great story. So many of them are happening right now under our noses. And it doesn't matter if your audience is a theatre full of people, an intimate dinner for 2, or yourself. Finding and telling those stories will make all the difference. Now, as we are in holiday mode, you might be binging on Netflix or Disney. I would also recommend binging Matthew Dix's YouTube channel and his stories. They're absolutely a treasure to watch. Some are funny, whatever they are, they actually create a really emotional reaction, whether it's positive or negative, whatever he's trying to spin, they're just awesome. Okay, that's it for me. Enjoy the episode and have a very happy new year. You're awesome. See you in 2021.
Welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. Whether you're a first-time facilitator or a seasoned pro, listen in for tips and tricks to make a bigger impact at the next workshop you deliver. And now, your host. She went on a fishing tour and caught a barramundi on her first cast, Leanne Hughes.
Okay, I'd like to introduce today's guest, and he fills his days as a school teacher, storyteller, speaking coach, blogger, podcaster, a wedding DJ, minister life coach, and a rock opera author. His upcoming book, Storyworthy, Engage, Teach, Persuade and Change Your Life Through the Power of Storytelling, is his first non-fiction title, and his other novels have been translated into 25 languages worldwide. Plus, he's a 35-time Moth Story Slam champion and 5-time Grand Slam champion. Welcome to the show, Matthew Dix.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you here. And look, what a crazy and full repertoire of things that you do. You must get that comment a lot.
I do. My wife is not a huge fan of that list.
So I hopped onto YouTube last night to watch some of your videos, and the first one was the Moth story about you as a pole vaulter in high school.
Yeah, that was my one I ever told.
I can't believe that was your first one. You looked so seasoned. My husband and I were laughing out loud watching that. And then switched over to your TEDx talk about making decisions based on what your 100-year-old self would say. And I got to say, there were a few teary moments watching that. I think your video hit home for me.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you.
Yeah, I shared it on Facebook straight away. But I've got to ask, how did you become so good at telling stories?
Well, I mean, I used to say that I was just fortunate that I found this thing that I was able to do. And then my wife told me, you're an idiot. It wasn't because of that. What it turns out to be is that I've been sort of prepping for storytelling for a very long time through a bunch of things. The DJing was great because for 20 years I learned to speak extemporaneously in front of large groups of people. So I was comfortable in front of a crowd the first time I took the stage, and that helped a lot. I'm a novelist, so I'm accustomed to sort of the shape that stories should take, and I never really understood that would play a role until I started working with people on their stories, and I realized how people just don't really have that fundamental understanding all the time. And I've been blogging since 2006, and I've sort of discovered through the process of blogging that the more I reveal about myself, the more vulnerable I'm willing to be, the more I'm willing to tell on myself about the terrible things I may do on a daily basis, the more attention I would get from my audience. So I think those things sort of combined that night at the Moth when I decided to tell my first story. The idea that I was comfortable in front of people and I understood that they wanted me to be honest and as vulnerable as possible.
What was the first sort of vulnerable thing that you did reveal to people? Was it that story that the part that, you're this mediocre athlete at high school? Was that an embarrassing thing to share with the world?
I guess the part of that story that I'm really trying to express that I think people feel but never say is the moment where you occasionally root against your teammates because you want to be perceived as the best person on the team. And that's something that I think a lot of people, feel but would rarely speak aloud. So, that was what I was trying to go for that night when I was telling that story.
Yeah, cool. So back to storytelling, and I know just from my experiences, there's some people that I talk to, some friends, and they're just natural at storytelling. They break into telling about something that'll happen on their holiday. It's really funny and it seems effortless. And there's also, on the other end of the spectrum, some people that can tell you a story and with the first 2 sentences, you're switching off. So do you think it's something that's, I guess, natural, or is it something that a skill that you can learn? And is it an easy or difficult skill to appreciate?
Well, I teach it a lot, so I have to believe that it can be learned. And I've been teaching it now for about 5 years, and I have taken people who are truly terrible at telling a story and gotten them on a stage in a very short period of time and had them perform really brilliantly. So I do believe it can be taught. I do believe it can be learned. And I think a lot of it is just sort of the ability to listen to stories. I think the people who are natural storytellers, the ones that don't need to work with me, they're just good listeners, and they've picked up this craft along the way that they're not even aware that they picked up. And others just need some help understanding how a story works and what is a story and what isn't a story, because that's often half the battle.
Oh, yeah. So how do you define what a story is then?
Well, I always say that a story is not a series of events. So someone may come to you and say, let me tell you about my vacation. And no one's really ever wanted to hear the next sentence of that story.
Yes.
Because what they're really saying is, I'd like to run through the itinerary of my vacation with you so I can relive it again. And I'll insert good meals along the way. But that's not something that's going to move us. So for a story to really be a story, it needs to be something in your life that happened that caused some kind of change in you. I usually say transformation or a realization. So I was this person, but now I'm this person. And it can be a negative transformation. It could be I used to be a decent human being and now I'm not. Something as simple as I used to think my mom was an idiot, and now I understand that everything my mom has ever told me was absolutely true. I really can't believe it. And so there has to be that, that arc, that journey from I was one thing to now I'm another, which people tend not to understand. They tend to tell stories which are just series of things that happen to them. But in the end, they're fundamentally the same person. And those stories aren't memorable. And oftentimes they're not very good to listen to.
Yeah, okay. So is there like a secret structure to telling these stories that where you talk about the shift in behavior or your thoughts around something?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to it, and I say there's a lot of secrets. But the big secret I often tell people is that every story is about a 5-second moment in our life. It's really that moment of realization or transformation. I call it a 5-second moment because I really believe it takes place over about the course of 5 seconds, where you suddenly, for whatever reason, shift into a new person or shift into a new understanding. And once I'm able to find one of those moments, sort of the moment in the story we were talking about, the moment I realize I'm rooting against my teammate because I'm a selfish jerk who wants to be perceived as better than everybody else, as soon as I find that moment, I know that's always going to be the end of my story because it's going to be the most important thing I say. And if people would just do that, if they would just ask themselves, what moment of realization or transformation can I talk about and make that the end of my story, they're going to be better off than most storytellers already.
Wow. Okay. So why do you think it is important for people to share information using stories?
Well, I think it's the best way to share information. It's the most captivating way. I often say that I'm a fundamentally unlikable person who tells a good story, and I managed to get through life, on that trait. I'm a horrible golfer. I am really the worst golfer of any golfer I've ever played with. And yet I'm asked to play constantly, almost daily, because the people who play golf with me know that when I hit the ball into the trees and we go looking for it, I'm going to entertain them on the way. And so that ability to sort of grab attention, and through a story, you can just sort of get people to do a lot of things that they might not normally do, or convince people to think a certain way that they might not normally think. I often say no one has ever asked to see a PowerPoint presentation a second time, right? Or said, wow, that graph was so amazing. I'd love to see it again. But we'll watch the same movie that we have watched 10 times, an 11th time if it randomly comes on the television one night, because we love stories so much more than anything else.
Yeah, so true. So in the work environment, so you'd recommend, instead of, dialing up a PowerPoint slide presentation with the corporate template, would you just recommend launching into a story about how your new idea will shift the organisation, and would you make it personal? How do you sort of start even mapping out what that story would look like in business?
Yeah, I mean, I always start with a story. I have to do presentations as a teacher, and I'm often doing presentations now at corporations and nonprofits for storytelling. And my first goal is to tell a story that's going to relate to the goal of the day, but also going to reveal something about me. I don't want to be a presenter that's sort of forgettable, because most presenters are. You'll go to a conference and you'll hear some information, but you won't remember the person 3 days later, which means you haven't made a meaningful connection. So if I can share something that is vulnerable or amusing or even embarrassing, I've now established myself as someone who is memorable or entertaining, or someone who you just want to know a little bit more about. And so I'll always start with that. And then eventually, I may work into a PowerPoint or into a graph or into that more traditional presentation style. But I always want to start with a story. I always want to connect with my audience so that they will believe the things that I am saying.
Yeah, that's very authentic as well. And like you said, it does create that personal connection, and it's so different to what everyone else is doing, because most people, I guess, they expect to go into a board meeting or for an example, switch on the computer and fire it up, and that's the way it sort of goes. So I guess by using that story, you're automatically hooking them in.
Yeah, if you watch any of my TED Talks, actually, I always open with a story. And the story is going to inform what I want to talk about after the story. But I want that story to be something that causes people to feel connected to me and relate to the content I want to present. And then I'll often end the TED Talk with either another story, or I will finish off that first story. So we begin with story, we end with story. People feel entertained and sort of full. They feel moved and, connected with me. And then the content that I sandwich in the middle manages to get in there sort of sneaky, like they don't even notice it's happening.
Yeah, you're right. Because when I put on your second video last night, my husband was like, oh, let's do something else. But then I think in the first minute you hooked him in, and he was there watching it for 15 minutes, which was awesome. I'd love to hear about the level of detail that you go in. So sometimes when you're describing an event, you'll really describe it quite evocatively and outline like the greasy tiled floor that you were lying on at McDonald's. In my experience hearing stories, some people give too much detail, some people not enough. Where's the fine line in providing detail?
I always think it's not how much, but where it should be and where it shouldn't be. So there are moments like the moment you've spoken about when I'm in a robbery in the back of a restaurant and there's a gun to my head. I want you to be on the floor with me, and I want you to feel the grease and the barrel of the gun, and I want you to see and smell everything because it's such a unique situation and it's the most important moment in that story. So I want you there with me. But quite often I will tell people don't include any detail. So if I'm telling a story I'm working on a story right now about my grandmother, and I open with her in a garden, I will just say the word garden because it's irrelevant what type of garden it is. Mm-hmm. And if I just say garden, you just automatically fill in a garden of your choice. So you end up doing a lot of work for me without me wasting any words. And without even knowing it, if I say the word garden to you, you automatically choose a season. You automatically choose the weather on that day. You choose what is in that garden. And as long as it's not pertinent to the story, those details, I want you to do the work for me. It'll also create a landscape that you are more familiar with so that when you put my grandmother in your garden, you feel like you're a little bit at home because it's a sense of like, oh, I understand what that garden is. Even if the garden she happens to be in is full of corn and carrots and you put her in a flower garden, that's fine. I love the fact that you've created the garden that you are most comfortable with. So it's all a matter of choosing which moments need to be described and which moments can be let go. I think people either describe everything or they don't describe anything, and they don't find that moment where slow it down here and give us the detail that we need because now we've hit a critical moment or a moment that people really can't visualize without words.
So let's talk about storytelling in facilitation and particularly in workshops. I definitely think it's a useful tool to explain whatever you're trying to get through to your audience. With your stories, do you actually have a bucket of stories that you have which you can lean on and go, this one's a great one to use when I want to explain leadership. This one's about integrity. Do you have like an Excel spreadsheet or how do you store that information?
I do have an Excel spreadsheet.
Oh,
it's
yay.
fairly insane. Yeah, it's a crazy spreadsheet. It has dozens of tabs and it really is insane. But what happens is if you build up enough stories, that's what I encourage people to do is sort of keep telling stories and keep crafting them. Eventually, when I am asked to speak on a topic, it is never relevant what that topic is because I will always have a story for it. I had to do a talk at a human trafficking conference one time. They asked me to close out the conference with an inspirational story related to human trafficking. And the conference organizer called me a couple of days before and she said, have you researched human trafficking? And I said, absolutely not. Like they've just spent 3 days hearing about human trafficking. I'm going to tell you a story and then relate it to the importance of battling human trafficking. And she was very worried about how that talk was going to go. And I told a personal story about my life and how I failed to act quickly when I could have helped a student. And I related that back to the importance of when it comes to things like human trafficking, we can't allow politicians to say that change takes place over time and big ships are slow to turn because these are human lives at stake and not making widgets. And it really went well. And it was completely different from anything else said in the conference. And I'm just able to do that with every topic now because I have 150 stories that I've told on stages over the years, and I can apply any one of them to any topic whatsoever. So the trick is to be a storyteller with a large amount of content, and then the topics are irrelevant because you can always match what you have to what they need.
And do you collect those stories in real time? Like you just, oh, wow, that's interesting, and get out your phone and go into Evernote? Or is it something at the end of the day? Like what's your process?
I actually have a TED Talk called Homework for Life that you can go and
Nice.
get a lot of detail on it. But what I do essentially is at the end of every day, I sit down with my spreadsheet and I ask myself, what is the most story-worthy moment of my day? If I had to tell a story about something that happened today, even if that moment is fairly benign and irrelevant, I still write it down. I put it down in just a few sentences in a spreadsheet so I don't make it so onerous that I won't continue to do it day after day. And my goal was to get like maybe a story every couple months to add to my list of stories. But what happened over time is really remarkable. I've developed this lens for storytelling such that I can sort of see stories where other people don't. And so my wife says Matt can turn anything into a story, and that's not really true. And my friend tells me Matt can pick up a rock and make it into a story, the process of picking up the rock. And that's not true either. But what I try to explain to them is I just see stories where you don't, because I've developed this lens over time by continually asking myself this question. And I've discovered that the smallest moments in our lives make the best stories. So even though like I've died twice and been brought back by CPR, and you know about my robbery, and I've been homeless for a period in my life and arrested and tried for a crime I didn't commit, all of those things aren't my best stories. Really, my best stories are tiny little moments that I experience and that I see because of this process that I've been engaged in for like the last 3 or 4 years.
And do you think it's those tiny little stories because they're probably more relatable to, because I haven't had 2 near-death experiences, but do you think that's why they're so good, those little ones?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. When I tell my near-death experiences, and I've told those stories, you can see them on the internet, I always have to find the tiny little moment in the big story so that I can connect with my audience. So when I was 17, I was in a car accident. I went through the windshield, died on the side of the road. But the fact that I die on the side of the road and get brought back to life is almost irrelevant to the story. It's not the point of the story. The point of the story happens later on in the emergency room when my parents fail to show up. They go to check on the car before they come to check on me when they hear I'm in stable condition. But my friends show up. My 16 and 17 and 18-year-old friends show up in the emergency room unexpectedly. And they fill in for my family and really become my family until I meet my wife. And that is something people can connect to. You can't connect to me going through a windshield, but you can connect to the idea that parents sometimes let us down, or that friends sometimes pick us up, or we feel alone at points in our lives when we really shouldn't feel alone. And so you find the little moments and the big ones, but the easiest stories to tell are just start with the little ones, and then you don't have to play with them.
It's a pretty powerful skill you have in terms of the way that you can transition emotion. So last night I was saying within 5 minutes we were laughing, then we watched a second video and it was like, whoa. How do you feel about having that kind of responsibility?
It's a trick of storytelling, really. It's my favorite stories and the ones my wife likes the best are the ones that are laugh, 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 cry. So I get you laughing at the beginning of the story, not realizing the horror that is to come. I always say it's better to make people laugh before they cry because it hurts more that way. So, part of storytelling is the manipulation of emotion, because the ultimate goal is I want you to feel the same way I felt or as close to it as possible. So if I'm surprised in my real life, I want my audience to experience that similar surprise as I tell the story. So I'm constantly asking myself, how do I want my audience to feel at this moment? And so if my story is very heavy at the end, I want to balance it with humor at the beginning if I can. So, it's just that manipulation of emotion that a storyteller inevitably does in a way that it's rotten, but it really is the satisfying way that people want to hear stories.
Yeah, cool. So let's talk about your transition. You're doing a lot of keynote speaking, presenting, and then you're running workshops. Do you think there's a similar skill set that you've brought over? I mean, I know you're a teacher as well, so you've got that as a background. How have you used those skills in terms of getting engagement in workshops?
Well, I teach 5th grade. I teach 10-year-olds, and I've been teaching for 20 years. I often say they're the worst audience in the world. So I've really learned that you have to engage your audience. I am in workshops and in professional development or listening to speeches, and I'm astounded that the speaker doesn't attempt to do something entertaining or different. I think so often we assume that adults are willingly engaged in what we are about to present, like your husband actually, right? When I do my TED Talk, I don't assume that the person who's even chosen to listen to it wants to listen to it. And so I'm always thinking about when I'm beginning a workshop, when I'm beginning a keynote, I assume that no one wants to listen to anything I have to say. And the first thing I have to do is hook them. I have to find a way to get them to care about me and care about what I'm saying. And I just see so many people assume the opposite, that everyone wants to hear them, so they have to make no effort to be entertaining and engaging in the beginning. Kevin Smith, the comedian, wrote a biography, and in it he says that speakers have an obligation to be entertaining, regardless of their topic, every time they take the stage. And I believe that. And I believe you have to be entertaining initially and not assume that people want to hear anything you have to say.
It just seems like we're being overwhelmed with people that do operate off that assumption. How do we change this? I know you're starting out by writing a book about it. You've created these videos. We really need to start just a revolution.
Part of it is just rejecting what people are doing. If you're not going to be entertaining, I just reject I reject your content. I reject what you have to say. Part of it is giving feedback as well. It's so often, when I'm in a professional development situation and I'm asked to give feedback at the end of it, I believe that there's this desire to be kind to the person who took the stage because they were brave enough to take the stage. And so people avoid being honest with a speaker or a presenter about what they've actually done. They just think, well, they were kind enough to come here. We have to be nice enough to say something nice. And I think we should be honest in our feedback. And if they don't ask for feedback, if they don't solicit it, we have to be willing to send an email the next day saying, hey, here's a couple things you should think about. Until these people understand that we are not engaged in their material, they will just continue to do what they're doing.
That's really good advice. I think we'll link to your videos. That could even be a way. Nice attempt yesterday. Maybe you should watch this video and get some tips.
Yeah. I had a politician recently, a guy I know pretty well. He was trying to get a program cut in our school system, and it was a program that maybe needed to be cut. They were trying to save some money. And he said he did a year's worth of data collection, presented a beautiful PowerPoint with lots of charts, lots of evidence that showed we should cut this program and move the money somewhere else. And then he said one mother stood up and described how the program saved her son's life. And he said, I always lose to the anecdote. And I told him, you took a knife to a gunfight. You thought that a PowerPoint was going to change the hearts and minds of people when a mother with a child is going to change the hearts and minds of people. So I'm working with politicians now telling them, you have to tell a story. Nobody cares about your facts and figures, that you have to be a personality who is engaging and who tells a story. And I think I'm starting to understand that to a great degree.
Yeah, I think so too. So in terms of your workshops, they're engaging, interactive, and then the participant walks out and leaves the workshop. What is the best way to embed learning, do you think, following a workshop when someone leaves that environment?
Well, hopefully they can buy my book, and that will help a little now. But one of the things I do is I call it homework for life. The idea that you're going to look for stories every day. And I say for life because I really do mean that if you're going to start doing this, you'll do it for the rest of your life. I believe that when I teach, my goal is to take a large and complex process like storytelling and break it down into the smallest possible parts, so that even if you spend 8 hours in a workshop with me and you pick up just 5 small things that you can begin doing immediately that are easy to implement and can be repeated over and over again, you'll begin doing that and you'll notice the changes in yourself as a storyteller. And then you're going to be more likely to maybe come watch one of my videos or come to one of my advanced workshops to learn even more, or to pick up my book now and read more about it. I think that so often when I'm in a workshop, nobody is looking to sort of break things down into tiny concrete parts. And maybe because I'm an elementary school teacher for 20 years, that's what I understand about curriculum. And so I really do try to teach in the smallest possible terms. And I scale it so that the first things I say are always going to be the most important. And as we get through the day, I'm going to become more and more nuanced. And the things that I'm teaching are going to be less important, although still important. So that when I have them at their maximum attention and maximum energy, I'm teaching them the most important things, and truly things that are going to be so simple that they can go home and start doing immediately. So don't teach big things. Just like, in storytelling, we're looking for 5-second moments to tell a story. I'm looking for tiny bits that people can use.
Yeah, great. So let's talk about your book. It's coming out in June. I've already pre-ordered my version off Amazon.
Thank you.
So you've written novels. This is your first nonfiction book. What made you decide to pick up the pen and write something and share this experience with the world?
Well, I did workshops for about 4 years. And over the course of those workshops, I actually started grudgingly. People kept asking me to do it, and I said no. And eventually I agreed to do one and done. That's what I said. And I fell in love with the teaching of storytelling. But over the course of that time, I really began to refine what I was doing. So if you had taken a workshop with me in year 1 versus now, it would be entirely different. And as I began to develop that curriculum in a way that people responded to positively, and I saw them implementing really effectively, I realized that I can't reach everybody by having them come and join me on a Saturday, for 8 hours. And I started to get quite a bit of demand from around the world, really, from people who would either say, can you please fly out to LA and teach a workshop? Or do you have some material you can provide for us, a book and things like that? So my goal was to take the workshop that I teach, really this weekend-long workshop that I teach in various places, and turn that into a book. So if you can't join me for a weekend, if you can't make it to where I am and I can't make it to where you are, you'll have this to get you launched into storytelling. It's not going to be the same. It's not going to be as interactive. You're not going to laugh. I try to make people laugh throughout all of my workshops. There are funny moments in the book, but my goal is if you can't make it to me, you can start with this, and then maybe we can talk later on.
Mm-hmm. And how does the book work? Is it sort of like a sequence of you start with lesson 1 and then you build up over the course of it? Or is it just different tips and tricks you can start pretty much anywhere?
No, I've designed it like my workshops. So the beginning chapters are going to be more important than the later chapters. Mm-hmm. The big fundamental building blocks are in the first few chapters. I've also embedded lots of stories so that they can serve as models for what you're learning. And I've crafted in a bit of memoir as well so that you can sort of watch my journey on storytelling as well. I love Stephen King's book on writing. I think it's brilliant for writers. And I love it because I learn a little bit about the writer's life in the process. So my goal was to write that version for storytelling. So it's going to be instructive, but you're also going to go on my storytelling journey with me. And you're going to meet some of the great storytellers that I've met along the way and learn some of their craft tips as well. So I'm hoping that even if you're not terribly interested in storytelling, the book is going to be entertaining enough that you'll read it. So even, like storytelling for dating has become really popular for me now. It's always guys who can't get a second date, so they come to my workshops. So it's not just the idea that presenters or performers are going to be using this book, but really almost anyone can benefit from storytelling. And I'm hoping the book is entertaining enough that it holds their attention and that they'll get through it.
Storytelling for dating. What's that workshop about? I have to ask.
It's my regular workshop, although I have a couple set up where it would be exclusively dating and we'd have like a meal and things. But essentially it's the idea that on your first date, it's your opportunity to communicate to people with whoever you're with. And so often people don't know what to say. They say the wrong thing all the time. They don't tell a good story, or they're not willing to be vulnerable in front of someone. They brag. They're just awful people on the first date. Oftentimes they're the worst version of themselves because they're not being themselves. So I teach them that tell the story about the embarrassing moment you had this week and tell it well. Someone once asked my wife, someone said, "Why did you first fall in love with Matt?" And I was so happy I was there because I sort of wanted to know what that answer was. I figured it would be like, well, look at him. Obviously I felt, but she said it's never been what I looked like. But she told me about a night when we were still just friends and we were teaching together and we went to a restaurant while we were waiting for a school talent show. And it was the first time we ever really sat down together and had dinner. And she asked me questions. And if you ask me a question, I'm always going to tell you a story. And she said that was the night I fell in love with him. Even though it took us another 6 months to get together, she said listening to him tell stories was the moment I fell in love because I wanted to hear more and I loved listening to what he had to say. So storytelling got me the best wife ever. And I really believe it can at least get you the second date. I can't guarantee anything after that. Now you're on your own. But if you can really speak well and represent yourself well on a first date, I think you can get a second date fairly easily.
Yeah, I think so. That's a beautiful story that your wife told as well.
Yeah, I know. I was mad at her actually when she told it because I was into like year 3 or 4 of workshops at that point. And I said, you never told me that. That fits my personal narrative so well. Like I can brand that. And she said, I'm not really in the business of making sure your personal narrative is up to par.
So watch out what she says around you sometimes, I bet.
Yeah. I mean, I have to run things by her sometimes when when a story involves her.
Yeah, I bet. So Matthew, where can people find you and find your book?
Well, you can find me at MatthewDix.com, and you can find my book everywhere. It's Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Your local independent bookstore will have it. You can pre-order it or get it there when it comes out in June. And there'll be an audiobook. I'm actually going to be narrating the audiobook. It'll be my first time doing that. All of my novels are in audio, but they've been narrated by other people, so that'll be a first for me.
Oh, wonderful. I've heard that process is, pretty interesting. It's pretty intense, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't done it yet, but I've been told it's going to take me at least 3 days, which sounds terrible to sit in a little booth for 8 hours a day for 3 days reading words that, I wrote a long time ago.
Well, we can't wait to hear it. Matthew, it'd be great to have you down under some time. I'm sure after the release of this book, maybe there'll be some opportunities there. I can't believe everything that you've done, but just watching all your videos and hearing from you as well today, it's just so exciting. I think this is really relevant to all of our listeners, and they'll be championing this episode. I think it's a really good one.
I'm so glad. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for tuning in to First Time Facilitator. If you liked the episode, please share it with your mates or subscribe to the podcast feed in iTunes. Till next time,